All right, are you ready to dive into a case that's going to stay with you? This one's got it all, folks. Really, we're talking mystery, family drama,
Mhm.
and even some incredible science.
We're going to be looking at the tragic murder of Linda Slayton in Lakeland, Florida,
Lakeland, Florida, yeah.
back in 1981.
1981, yep.
And she was a single mother.
Devoted to her sons, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. And to make this even more chilling, her two young sons, Jeff and Tim, they were home,
At the time, yeah.
asleep while this was all happening.
Just feet away. It's hard to even fathom that. And as we go through this story together, you're going to see that the killer wasn't some stranger lurking in the shadows, but someone they knew.
Someone they trusted.
Someone they trusted, yeah. So in this deep dive, we're going to go through decades of searching for answers. We're going to look at how forensic science has changed, and ultimately we'll see how justice was served in this case.
It's a story that shows, even when things are at their darkest, the truth can win out. And it also shows just how important technology is in solving these crimes that we used to think were unsolvable.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, let's try to get a sense of who Linda Slayton was, the woman at the heart of all of this. And for that, we'll turn to the memories of her sons, Jeff and Tim.
They described her as just a loving and resourceful mother. Despite going through financial difficulties, she always put her boys first,
Lived in government housing.
relied on welfare.
She always found ways, though, to make life enjoyable for them. She would take them to the beach.
Parks, concerts, always trying to find a way to make things fun.
Yeah. It really speaks to the strength of a mother's love, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Even when things are tough, those moments of happiness, really make her loss even more profound.
It does. So let's shift now to the grim reality of September 4th, 1981. Police arrive at the Slayton apartment, and what they find is just devastating.
Linda's body, right?
Linda's body is discovered in her bedroom.
And the details of the crime scene are so crucial. Walk us through what the investigators found.
They found a wire coat hanger, and it was twisted tightly around Linda's neck. It's just chilling.
Yeah.
The window screen had been removed, possibly how someone got in, and they found shoe prints leading to the closet,
Okay.
a palm print on the windowsill, so potential clues were there, but they didn't have the advanced forensic technology back then.
Right. DNA analysis was in its very early stages.
Exactly.
So investigators, they had to rely on things like fingerprinting and blood typing.
Right.
It's hard to imagine, right, trying to piece together this complex puzzle without the tools we have today.
It must have been incredibly challenging.
It must have been incredibly challenging. And on top of that, the societal biases of that era really complicated their efforts to gather evidence.
Absolutely.
I remember reading about Sergeant Edgar Pickett, a really highly skilled African-American fingerprint expert. And he was told by a colleague, a black man don't have any business looking at a naked white woman.
It's just shocking, isn't it?
It's shocking.
It's a stark reminder of the deep-seated prejudice that was just everywhere back then, even in law enforcement.
Absolutely.
And this bias definitely impacted how they investigated. Instead of focusing on real leads and the evidence, they tragically focused on random black men.
It's just highlighting those systemic injustices of that time. And it's not just about the delay in finding justice. It's about the pain that it caused Linda's family.
Absolutely.
Makes you wonder how many other cases have been impacted by these kinds of biases.
Oh, I'm sure countless cases.
Yeah. And it really underscores how crucial it is for investigators to check their own biases, right? To make sure that everyone is treated equally under the law. And, listener, you can do your part too by advocating for police accountability and promoting diversity in law enforcement.
You're absolutely right. Now let's talk about the impact Linda's death had on her sons. It wasn't just losing their mother, it was also living under suspicion and fear.
Right, you can only imagine what they went through. Think about being a teenager, dealing with this unimaginable grief of losing your mother and then being treated like you might have something to do with it.
Right. Jeff, the older son, he was interrogated constantly, pulled out of school by the police, took multiple polygraph tests, and faced accusations that no grieving child should ever have to face.
And Tim, while he wasn't directly accused, he had to live with the knowledge that the person who did this was still out there. Someone he might even know.
Right.
Someone in his community. And that fear, it became a constant companion for him. It affected everything. His daily life, his relationships, his ability to trust.
And as you can imagine, both boys ended up dropping out of school.
Yeah.
They were struggling to cope with the trauma, the weight of this unsolved case. Jeff even thought about suicide, which just shows the depths of his despair.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder, isn't it, of the ripple effects of violent crime. It's not just the immediate victims. It's a shadow that hangs over the lives of their loved ones. And the community as a whole, right? They lived in fear, knowing that the person who did this was still out there. It creates this atmosphere of distrust and suspicion that lingers for years.
And as the initial investigation came up empty, the case sort of faded from the public eye. But for Jeff and Tim, that pain remained, always there. They never gave up hope that someday their mother's killer would be found.
But as time passed, decades went by, that hope started to dwindle. The case went cold, the trail went quiet, and it seemed like Linda Slayton's murder would just be another unsolved mystery.
But, and this is important, the story doesn't end there. The fight for justice, it's like that ember that refuses to go out. And in 1998, a dedicated detective, Brad Grace, decided to take another look.
Determined, huh?
Determined to find some answers for this family.
It was that little glimmer of hope, right? That chance to finally uncover the truth.
It was.
But what Detective Grace found was a tangled web of dead ends and setbacks. It would take incredible perseverance and maybe even a little luck to finally break through and solve Linda Slayton's murder. So Detective Grace picks up this case in '98, wants to find some answers for Linda's family. Now, technology, it's come a long way by then, and he was able to get the DNA from the crime scene, reanalyze it, get a full genetic picture of, well, the killer. This had to feel like a huge step forward.
It was. It was. This gave them a level of accuracy they just didn't have back in '81. Grace was able to compare the DNA profile against this growing database of well-known offenders, and he was really meticulous, investigated people connected to Linda, her ex-husband, a former boyfriend, even had to rule out, her sons.
Jeff and Tim?
Jeff and Tim, yeah. I can't even imagine having that conversation with them. But even with all this, no matches.
It's another dead end. And
Yeah.
it just shows how tough these cold cases are, even with new tools. Did Grace give up?
Not a chance. This guy, he was dedicated. He wanted to bring justice for Linda, for her sons. He even promised them that he wouldn't retire until this case was solved. And Grace kept at it, followed any leads that popped up, but years went by, nothing really concrete. And then he had to retire in 2015 because of health reasons, leaving this case, well, unresolved. His promise unfulfilled.
Yeah.
You can only imagine the disappointment. For him, for the family.
Yeah. Sometimes, even the best efforts, they come up short. And it felt like this case might just stay cold forever.
Okay.
But then something amazing happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's game-changing technology, genetic genealogy. It's like something out of science fiction.
Yeah, it might sound futuristic, but it's real, it's powerful. Basically, they use DNA like a family tree to track down someone. It's a giant genetic puzzle.
Right.
And each piece of DNA, well, it can lead you to distant relatives, and eventually you can pinpoint a specific person.
So how did this all play out in Linda's case?
Well, in 2018, there's this company, Parabon Nanolabs. They specialize in this new technology, and they reached out to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, offered their services. They had already cracked some pretty big cases using this, and they thought it might be the key to solving Linda's murder.
You mentioned the Golden State Killer case before, and wasn't that one of the first big ones they cracked using this? I mean, that case, it really captured everyone's attention. It showed the world what this technology could do.
You're right. The Golden State Killer case, it was a turning point, absolutely. And it really paved the way for it to be used in so many other investigations.
Okay, so walk us through how it works. How do they use this to find Linda's killer?
Well, they started by taking the DNA profile, the unknown killer's profile, and they uploaded it to GED Match. It's a public genealogy database. People put their DNA there to research their family history. And the goal here was to find anyone who shared enough DNA with the killer to maybe suggest a family connection.
So they were looking for distant relatives, people who, without knowing it, might hold a piece of the puzzle. It's kind of wild to think about someone's interest in their family history helping solve a murder.
It is. And in this case, it started coming together pretty quickly. In a matter of days, they had identified 3 genetic networks, and they all pointed to one family, deep roots in Lakeland, Florida. And this family, they only had one son living there back in '81.
Wait, so in days they had a potential suspect after decades of dead ends. That's incredible.
It is. It really shows you how quickly this can work. But, and this is where things get, well, more complicated, more chilling. Remember Tim, Linda's younger son? He loved football, and in the weeks after his mom's death, he found some comfort on the field. And he had a coach, someone he looked up to, a support system. They called him Coach Joe.
Sounds like Coach Joe was a positive presence in Tim's life. Someone to lean on during such a tough time. Was this coach connected to the family they found through the genealogy research?
He was. Coach Joe, his real name was Joseph Mills, and he was the same Joseph Mills identified through the genetic genealogy as the likely source of that DNA at the crime scene.
Are you saying Linda's killer was her son's football coach? That's just shocking. For Tim to learn that someone he trusted, someone who was there for him, was the one who took his mother from him, it's a betrayal on a whole other level.
You can't imagine. And it gets worse. There's a team photo taken just a few weeks after Linda's murder, and there's Joseph Mills standing right behind Tim, smiling for the camera. To think that he was so close to them, acting like he cared with this secret, it's really chilling.
Just let that image sink in for a moment. Imagine what Tim must have gone through when he found out. It's a whole new layer of horror to this already tragic story.
It is. It shows you that sometimes evil hides in plain sight, looks like normalcy, kindness. I'm sure for Tim it just shattered any sense of trust he had. But finding Joseph Mills, it was a huge step, but it was just the beginning. Now they had to build a case, get hard evidence, and bring into trial.
So they have his name, his face, and he's connected to the victim. What happens next?
Well, they had a good lead, but they still needed something concrete, something to directly tie him to the crime. They had that palm print, but they wanted to be absolutely sure, so they went after his DNA. But after 38 years, it's not easy.
He wasn't going to just offer it up knowing he was their main suspect. How did they get it?
They had to get creative. First, they put him under surveillance, hoping to get something discarded, like a coffee cup, a tissue, anything. But Mills was careful, didn't give them a chance. So they had to get, well, a little less conventional. They took his trash from the curb outside his house.
Talk about digging for clues, huh? It doesn't sound glamorous, but it shows how committed they were to solving this.
Yeah,
So did they find what they needed in his garbage?
they did. In the trash, they found a piece of used medical tape, the kind used for a colostomy bag. And here's the thing, there was a photo on Mills's Facebook from a few years back, showed him with a colostomy bag. Very specific evidence, tied him directly to that trash and potentially to the crime scene.
Wow. It's like that one missing piece of the puzzle. Sounds like they had him cornered. Was this enough to link him to Linda's murder? Without a doubt.
Just to be completely sure, they took other things from the trash, cotton swabs, a plastic spoon, just to have multiple samples, sent it all to the lab for testing, and then they waited. 11 days later, they got the news. Perfect match. The DNA from Joseph Mills matched the DNA from Linda Slayton's murder scene.
After 38 years, they finally had an answer. What a moment for everyone, the investigators, Linda's family, and even for Joseph Mills. He couldn't hide anymore. So what did he do when they confronted him?
Well, you'd expect some shock, denial, anger, right? But he was surprisingly calm. At first, he said he didn't remember Linda Slayton or the murder. Then when they showed him pictures of Linda, her sons, his story changed. Said he remembered them, but never knew Linda personally.
Sounds like he was grasping at straws, trying to separate himself from the victim, downplay any connection. Kind of classic deception, wouldn't you say?
It is. And he kept trying to manipulate things, denied ever coaching Tim, ever being inside the Slayton house, even though they knew he was lying. But the detectives, they kept pressing him, hoping he'd slip up, reveal something.
It's that cat and mouse game. Investigators using their experience to break down the lies, expose the truth.
Right. And finally, with all the evidence against him, his story changed again. Now, he claimed he met Linda for the first time on the day of the murder, that she invited him in through her unlocked window that night, even came up with this story about consensual, wild sex with a wire coat hanger at her request.
It sounds like a desperate attempt to shift the blame, trying to make Linda look bad and him, well, like he was just going along with some fantasy. But the evidence, Linda's injuries, it didn't add up at all.
You're right. This was a brutal rape and murder, not some consensual encounter. And the detectives, they saw right through his lies. They pointed out how bad her injuries were, how deep the wire had cut into her skin. And his response, it was a game.
That's chilling. No remorse, no care for what he did. It's like textbook narcissism, rewriting history, even when he's caught. So what happened next?
December 12th, 2019, they arrested Joseph Mills, charged him with burglary, sexual battery, and first-degree murder. For Jeff and Tim, they're in their 50s now, this news, it was a mix of relief and, well, heartbreak. They finally had a name, a face, for the person who did this, but it was someone they had trusted.
Must have been such an emotional moment for them. All those years, they finally had their answer, but it came with this terrible realization. Makes you think, can there ever really be closure after something like this?
That's a tough question, and we'll get into that, the search for healing, for justice, in the last part of our deep dive.
We've been through a lot with this case, haven't we? From the very beginning back in 81, all the way to these breakthroughs with genetic genealogy. It's been a roller coaster, and I'm sure you're feeling it too, listener. So where do we go from here? They arrested Joseph Mills, charged him with Linda's murder, but is that really closure?
It's hard to say, really. For Jeff and Tim, it brought up so many emotions. Relief that they finally caught him, anger at the betrayal, and I guess a sense of closure, but mixed with the pain of losing their mother. It's a long road to healing, and it's different for everyone.
In Mills, he decided to plead guilty, all the charges, avoided a trial and maybe a death sentence. So he was held accountable, but he never had to face Linda's family, never had to answer that question, the one that haunted them for decades, why?
But the sentencing, it gave Linda's family a chance to confront him. Jeff, he was overwhelmed, grief, anger, just kept asking Mills why. Why did he take his mother from him? Linda's sister, Judy, she wanted to know if he felt any remorse, any guilt for the pain he caused. But Mills, he just sat there silent.
It's heartbreaking. Even when he's convicted, he couldn't give them an explanation, any empathy. That silence, it speaks volumes.
It does. He didn't acknowledge their pain, wouldn't explain anything. It just added to their hurt. Sometimes those questions we want answers to, they just stay unanswered.
And when Mills finally got to speak, all he said were these self-serving things. Claimed he was a good person, that he wasn't a monster, even bragged about his business, his generosity. Classic deflection, trying to rewrite history, even when he's facing a life sentence.
Yeah, you see that a lot. People who can't or won't face what they've done. They downplay it, try to seem innocent, even with all the evidence against them.
In the end, Joseph Mills, life in prison, no parole. He'll never hurt anyone again, but that doesn't erase the pain he caused Linda's family. That loss, it'll always be there, a reminder of a life cut short, a future stolen.
Jeff, he said knowing Mills was locked up brought him some relief, but the anger's still there, and forgiveness, it's a struggle. Tim, he seems to be moving forward, but their paths to healing, they're different. Trauma affects everyone differently.
And we can't forget that team photo, the one with Mills standing right behind Tim just weeks after Linda's murder. Pim, he kept that photo all these years. It represented support, comfort during a terrible time. To realize that he was looking at his mother's killer all this time is disturbing.
Really shows how sneaky betrayal can be. Evil disguised as kindness, it gets into your life when you least expect it, and the impact of that, it's huge.
This case has been a lot. The horror of it all, those dead ends, the hope that came with this new technology, and then justice, but with a bitter taste. It's easy to forget this isn't just a story. It's real people, real lives, forever changed.
Absolutely. And as we finish up here, it's worth thinking about the bigger picture. Genetic genealogy, it's amazing for solving crimes, but it also brings up questions about privacy, consent. As this technology keeps developing, we need to talk about the ethical side of things.
You're right. Finding justice shouldn't mean sacrificing individual rights and freedoms. But for now, let's take a moment to remember Linda Slayton, a loving mother, a bright light gone too soon. May her memory remind us to hold our loved ones close, to speak up against what's wrong, and to never lose hope, even when things are tough.
And listener, I'll leave you with this. What does justice really mean to you? Is it catching the bad guy, punishing them, finding those answers we desperately want? Or is it something more? Something about the strength of the human spirit, about love and memory that never fades?
Something to think about. And if you want to learn more about this case, check out the resources we mentioned, especially the documentary, The Betrayal of Linda Slayton. It really goes deep into the investigation and its impact.
Thanks for being with us on this journey. It was a tough one, but hopefully it got us thinking and reminded us that even in the darkest moments, truth and the human spirit, they can win in the end.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.